There's no evidence that trans athletes have an advantage over anyone else. And there has just been an obsession on trans people's bodies, and particularly on trans women's bodies.
Another activist from the Wi-Fi password movement just went on live TV and gave us all a bad name. First, we've got to talk a little bit more about the fallout from President Trump's executive order attempting to restrict women's sports nationwide and in institutions bound by Title IX, the federal law, to exclude trans women who are born biologically male. As you can imagine, and as we already covered on this show, this is not being received well by the alphabet people, by the extreme LGBTQ activists, and one of them went on CNN for one of the strangest and just most detached from reality segments I've seen on cable news in some time, and that's saying something. Meet Chris Mosier, a trans man and athlete who's become an activist against policies like President Trump's executive order that restrict female sports for females. He went on CNN and had some things to say. Let's take a listen to the first clip here.
So when you hear people say, this is how it should be, trans athletes have a competitive advantage over non-trans athletes, what do you say to them?
There's no evidence that trans athletes have an advantage over anyone else in sports. Trans athletes play sports for the same reasons as anybody else, for our love of the game, to be a part of a team, to challenge ourselves, and most of all, for the youth level, to have fun. And every young person deserves that opportunity to be their authentic self and to play the sports that they love without compromising any part of who they are.
So this right here is everything that's wrong with modern trans and LGBT activism. Live your life how you want. You know what? Knock yourself out, call yourself what you like, dress how you will, present differently. I do not care. And I think most Americans generally are tolerant and open-minded, but don't gaslight us. Don't deny science. Don't deny basic biology and tell us with a straight face that there's no evidence that trans women, that's what this segment is about, have an advantage in sports. It's common sense in basic biology, first and foremost. They are born biologically male. Most of them have gone through male puberty, and they retain some advantages even after going on hormones and all that, which reduces it but doesn't eliminate it. And we all know that. They're taller, they have greater wingspans, their bone density is different, their hearts are bigger. So many things are different between males and females, and transition doesn't totally change that. And for you to get up on TV and say with your whole chest, there's no differences, nothing to see here, is absurd. We all know it's not true, and it just feels insulting to our intelligence, and people naturally recoil at this kind of insult to their intelligence. And the rest of it, you know, trans people play sports for the same reason as everyone else, is just kind of irrelevant because nobody doubted that. Nobody said, or at least most of us aren't saying that trans people are evil and want to play in sports just to harm anyone. Like, no, maybe they just want to win, they want to compete, they want to have fun, and that's fine, and they should be allowed to compete in their own leagues, their own divisions, or in the division associated with their biological sex. But it's just most of that answer is a non sequitur. And then the main part of it is just an insane gaslighting statement. And guys, there's plenty of research showing that the advantages are partially retained by trans athletes, trans women. Even after they transition, they still retain some benefits from male puberty. I'll link to a couple studies below. Now, there are studies on the opposite side suggesting that the advantage does go away. Those studies tend to be pretty flawed. I debunked one of them on my channel a while back because it was total junk science. But this guy, Chris Mosier, could try to make that argument. He doesn't even try. He just denies reality. And that's the kind of thing that is really rubbing people the wrong way, that the LGBT movement, because it's kind of just kowtowed to these radical trans activists, has basically started telling people biology isn't real, and the things we all know about sex and as a material fact of life aren't true. People aren't going to buy that. They're not going to fall for that. And the CNN hosts did not really sufficiently push back on this pseudoscience. Here's a second clip from the interview.
I'm curious about that, Chris, because you say that there's no evidence that there's a competitive advantage, but we've heard from parents who've had a different experience. They've argued that there is irrefutable evidence, irrefutable differences in physiology between the sexes, that hormone therapies don't sufficiently level the playing field. Do you get where they're coming from?
We know that each body is different, every person is different, and that even amongst cisgender kids, that are kids that are not transgender, there are differences in their strength, their speed, their ability, their natural ability, as well as differences in their access to good coaching, to great equipment, to things like rest and recovery or proper nutrition, all of the things that go into making someone be a good athlete. And I think that people don't really consider those other factors. The laser focus has been on hormone therapy or testosterone. And when we're talking about young kids, which is part of what this executive order will be applying to, I think we really miss the mark when we're focusing so heavily on biology and not on the lived experience of kids who are just trying to have the educational experience as their peers.
Oh? I mean, he kind of says the quiet part out loud when he tells people not to focus on the biology and to focus on the lived experience of the trans athletes or whatever. No, actually, the question is about safety and fairness. And so what matters there is the biology and the facts, not people's feelings. And there's this very annoying thing that they often do when they push this side of the argument, which is to essentially suggest that, well, you know, trans athletes may have some advantage, but sports are unequal in lots of ways. There's lots of differences. Okay, then why are boys and girls sports separated? Why not just have one team? Let everyone try out and then cut the worst people and just put the best people on the team. Because in most sports, for most people, and we're generalizing here, there's exceptions to every rule, boys would have a huge advantage and girls would have very minimal access to sports and competition and opportunities. That's why sports exist in sex-distinct categories, because yes, there are variations within each sex, but there are huge differences between the two sexes. And there are even some things out there where females seem to have an advantage in some sense on certain things. But for most sports, the kind of upper body strength and other things associated with the male sex just kind of create a huge gulf that requires these two distinct categories. But I even had this as in my own experience in a gender studies class that I took in college. Yes, I subjected myself to that on purpose. I was curious. And you know what, to their credit, the professor I had, who did identify as trans, of course, was fairly open-minded and did encourage discussion. Of course, it was me versus the entire classroom, but that was kind of typical of my college experience. But anyway, the professor actually suggested at one point that when I pointed out, you know, there's biological differences between athletes, and that's kind of why male and female are separate categories, because men are stronger and faster than women on average. The professor argued that we actually don't know if that's true. That could just be because of the social distinction in the resources and prioritization of sports, that boys' sports are given more emphasis and attention and resources at a young age, and that may be true. But babe, the biology is still a thing. There's a reason that you look at the elite level female athletes in track and field who have access to the best training and diet and everything in the world, and you compare them to the men, and there's a difference. It's not just society doesn't prioritize women's sports as much, which, to be clear, that may be true. That might be a piece of it, but biology is a huge thing. And ultimately, what these people run up against is not bigotry, is not hate, although there's some of that out there. It's biology and facts, and they would have such a better case for the trans movement, for trans acceptance, and for the LGBT community more broadly if they didn't so openly and so brazenly deny reality and deny science, and cast aspersions at those of us who dare disagree with their anti-science ramblings. Take a listen to this final clip.
The executive order specifically targets trans women who want to participate in women's sports. Why do you think trans men are not included in this conversation, and what do you think about that?
There has just been an obsession on trans people's bodies, and particularly on trans women's bodies. And that's really evident here. You know, I think part of the reason from my own experience of being a trans man participating in men's sports, and the difference between myself and any trans woman who just wants to play, is that trans men don't fit this narrative that the Republicans are setting up. They don't fit the narrative that anyone assigned female at birth will be a worse athlete, that people assigned male at birth are bigger, faster, stronger, and better athletes. And we know that that's not true. Not every person assigned male at birth is a good athlete. And when we do have trans men who are able to participate in the men's category were largely ignored. And so I think that the issue here is really that laser focus, and it goes to a bigger picture of not just impacting sports, but really impacting and thinking about trying to legislate away the trans community. And sports has just been the entry point to other areas of discrimination against our community.
Chris, babe, as my mug says, your Delulu is showing. Now available at the merch store, linked in the description. In all seriousness, oh boy, this clip made me roll my eyes because this trans activist, Chris, basically suggested that when asked a fair question by the CNN host, which is like, well, why do you think the order only targets trans women and not trans men? Why do people only care in one direction? Chris says, well, they're just obsessed with trans women's bodies and they just ignore trans men like us. Babe, it's because no one cares about that. No one cares if you, as a person born biologically female, want to put yourself at a disadvantage and compete with the males. Knock yourself out. Most people have no problem with that. The reason they focus on trans women is because they're the ones with the potential advantage or safety concerns. That's why. It has nothing to do with obsessing with people's bodies or this kind of creepy aspersion of like sexual prurient interest that he seems to be suggesting we must have in order to have concerns about this. That's actually not it at all, my dude. And if you really think that, you haven't engaged honestly with criticisms or different ideas to any significant extent. And that seems to be the case because I actually reached out to Chris and emailed him and asked him to come on this channel and discuss this issue and told him, you know, I'll be respectful of you. I'll let you air your piece. I just want to exchange ideas. And he just replied to me with no words via email with a screenshot of a tweet where I explained why I don't support trans women and women's sports. And I replied and I'm like, yeah, I don't have the same view as you. That's why I want you to come on the channel, to offer a different view, to have a dialogue. Is that not something you do? You only go into safe spaces like CNN where they're not really going to push back. And that's the problem I had with the CNN segment is the pushback wasn't very solid. It was framed as, well, like parents might have concerns, not like hard science and studies contradict what you're saying. Here's pushback. And also, why isn't there an alternative perspective provided? Why isn't there a guest to show the other side of the argument? That's the criticism I had. I have no problem with them having an extreme activist on who advocates for a position, but there should be pushback and an alternative view if you're going to do balanced news. Anyway, though, Chris didn't respond and isn't going to be coming on the channel anytime soon. And frankly, I think that's because these activists know that their ideas can't withhold serious scrutiny, and that's why they stick to their safe spaces. Now, the final point that Chris made, talking about how the sports issue has just been an entry point to broader pushback and attacks on trans rights, sort of has a grain of truth to it, but kind of in the opposite direction of what Chris thinks. To me, it's more so that the LGBT activists and the alphabet people denied reality and biology and basic fairness so hard on this issue that, as my friend Brianna Wu, a moderate trans woman, has explained, should have been a pretty easy compromise to make, a pretty easy concession to make, to say, listen, we want acceptance, we want rights, but we're not crazy, we're not trying to harm anyone. So yeah, women's sports, the trans movement will agree, need to be restricted to females. But they were even unwilling to do that, a position 80% of the country supports, that's just common sense, that's just basic science and safety and fairness. And so a lot of people were like, whoa, these activists can't be trusted at all. We've got to disagree with everything they've got to say. And that's led to the broader decline in support for rights and acceptance. So Chris is sort of not wrong about that, but it didn't hit the way he thought it hit. What do you guys think about this CNN interview and about Chris Mosier more broadly? Are you convinced by these very strong, very compelling arguments? Let me know in the comments, and do hit that like button while you're at it, and make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet.